The law was clear, the money was stronger, and a child was about to be taken from the only person who ever chose him. The judge was ready to rule. Then a quiet man stood up in the back of the courtroom, holding a letter no one was supposed to remember. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The courtroom had gone quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. Even the faint hum of the ceiling lights seemed too loud. At the center of the room, a young boy stood between two adults, his small hands hanging stiffly at his sides. He did not cry. He did not move. His eyes shifted back and forth, searching for something familiar in a place that suddenly felt very far from safe. On one side stood his mother. Her shoulders were tense, her fingers clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned pale. She had spoken earlier, but now her voice was gone, trapped somewhere behind the tightness in her chest. Every few seconds, she glanced down at her son as if to remind herself he was still there, still within reach. Her breathing was shallow, controlled, practiced. The kind of control learned from years of getting through hard moments quietly. On the other side stood the boy's father, flanked by two attorneys in pressed suits. They did not look at the child. They spoke to the judge instead. Their words clipped and efficient. Income statements were cited, housing arrangements were listed, schedules were presented with confidence. Their voices carried no anger, no cruelty, only certainty. To them, this was a process, a negotiation, an outcome already calculated. The mother's lawyer tried to respond, but each sentence seemed to sink under the weight of numbers and precedent. The arguments were correct, technically sound. The law favored stability, defined by wealth, by square footage, by what could be measured on paper. No one mentioned bedtime stories. No one mentioned scraped knees kissed in dim kitchens after midnight. None of that fit neatly into a legal framework. The judge listened, his expression unreadable but heavy. His eyes moved slowly from one document to the next. He had heard cases like this before. Different names, same imbalance. His posture suggested patience, but also fatigue. The fatigue of someone who knew the limits of what he was allowed to do. He adjusted his glasses and folded his hands, already aware of where the law was pushing him. The boy shifted his weight slightly. The sound of his shoe against the floor echoed more loudly than it should have. He looked up at his mother, then quickly away, as if afraid to make things worse by looking too long. She noticed and swallowed hard, forcing herself not to reach for him. She had been told to remain composed. Composure apparently mattered. In the back row of the courtroom, a man sat quietly, almost invisible. He had not spoken. No one had introduced him. He was dressed simply, his posture relaxed but attentive. While the lawyers spoke, his gaze never left the child. Not once did he look at the paperwork or the attorneys. His eyes followed every small movement of the boy, every nervous shift, every glance toward his mother. Something about the scene had tightened his chest, not the arguments themselves, but the silence around what was missing, the absence of humanity in a room full of rules. He leaned back slightly, hands resting calmly in his lap, as if trying not to disturb the fragile balance of the moment. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to speak again. The room straightened. In response, pens were lifted, expectations hardened, and hanging in the silence was a question no one dared to ask out loud. What happens when the law is right, but justice feels wrong? The judge glanced down at the file once more, as if hoping something new might appear between the pages. It did not. The facts were the same as they had been all morning. Financial statements neatly organized, testimony already entered into record. The law did not bend easily, and it did not listen to silence. The mother felt the weight of that truth pressing against her ribs. She had known this moment was coming long before she stepped into the courtroom. Every sleepless night, every extra shift scrubbing floors after the building emptied, had been haunted by the same fear. That loving her child might not be enough. That effort could be outweighed by money. She kept her chin lifted, not out of confidence, but out of necessity. If she let herself break now, she might not be able to stop. Her eyes drifted briefly to the father. He stood upright, composed, his expression neutral. This was not personal to him, at least not in the same way. He believed he was doing what made sense, what the system rewarded. He trusted that the court would see reason the way he defined it: comfort, security, predictability. He did not notice how the boy's shoulders tightened whenever his name was spoken. The child's gaze returned to the floor. He traced the edge of a tile with his shoe over and over, a small act of control in a situation where he had none. He did not understand legal language, but he understood tone. He understood distance. He felt it growing already, like a shadow stretching between him and the woman who had always been there when the lights were off and the doors were locked. In the back row, the quiet man shifted slightly. His jaw tightened, then relaxed. He had sat in many rooms where power spoke loudly and humanity stayed silent. This one felt different, more fragile. The child reminded him of something he could not yet name, a memory just out of reach, a feeling that refused to stay buried. The judge looked up again. His voice when he spoke was steady but weary. He summarized what had been presented carefully, neutrally. Each word felt final even before a decision had been announced. The room leaned forward, bracing for impact. The mother's heart began to race. She placed one hand over the other to keep them from shaking. She did not pray aloud. She did not beg. She simply stood there, hoping someone somewhere could see what paperwork could not. The boy lifted his head at the sound of the judge's voice, his eyes wide and uncertain. He looked back at his mother, searching her face for reassurance. She met his gaze and offered the smallest smile she could manage. It was a promise made without words. "I am still here, no matter what." The man in the back row inhaled slowly. His fingers brushed against the inside of his coat, feeling the fabric grounding himself. He did not yet know why his chest felt tight, only that something important was unfolding in front of him, something that would not let him remain a passive witness. The judge paused mid-sentence, adjusting his glasses again, and in that pause, before any ruling could be spoken, the room held its breath once more. Unaware that this silence was not the end of the story, but the edge of it. The courtroom remained suspended in that fragile pause, as if time itself had slowed to observe what would come next. No one spoke. Even the lawyers seemed reluctant to disturb the stillness they had helped create. The judge's eyes rested briefly on the child again, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. It was not part of the record. It would never be written down. But it was there. The mother felt the room pressing in around her. Every sound seemed distant, muted by the pounding in her ears. She had prepared herself for disappointment, told herself that strength meant acceptance. Still, her chest ached with the effort of standing still, while her entire world balanced on a stranger's words. The boy shifted again, finally reaching out and catching the edge of his mother's coat with 2 fingers. The touch was tentative, almost apologetic, as if he were unsure he was allowed to ask for comfort. She did not pull him closer. She only let her hand fall near his, close enough for him to feel her warmth. It was the smallest rebellion against the rules of the room. In the back row, the quiet man's attention sharpened. His gaze moved from the child to the mother, then to the judge. Something inside him settled into place, like a memory finally finding its name. He realized this moment was not about arguments or outcomes. It was about being seen. The judge straightened, drawing a breath that signaled the end of waiting. Pens hovered. The father's attorneys prepared themselves. The mother closed her eyes for half a second, then opened them again. No one in the room knew that a forgotten letter, folded and carried for years, was about to challenge everything they believed this case was about. And the question still hung in the air unanswered. When the law is right, but justice feels wrong, who dares to speak? Years before the courtroom, before files and rulings and measured voices, Elena Morales learned how to live on very little sleep. Her days began before sunrise and often ended long after most lights in the city had gone dark. She worked as a cleaning staff member at a community center on the edge of downtown, a building that buzzed with activity during the day and emptied into silence at night. That silence was where her work lived. Elena pushed her cart slowly down long hallways, the wheels squeaking softly so she would not disturb anyone working late. She wiped tables still warm from afternoon programs, mopped floors, marked by hundreds of passing feet, and emptied trash cans filled with remnants of lives she would never meet. She did her job carefully, thoroughly, not because anyone was watching, but because it mattered to her that the place looked cared for when morning came. She did all of this after coming home from her first job, the one that barely covered rent, the one that offered no benefits and no flexibility. She stacked hours the way other people stacked savings, hoping one day they would amount to something safer. At home, a small apartment waited. It was never quiet for long. Her son Lucas filled it with noise and movement and questions. He was young then, still small enough to fall asleep with his socks on, and still believe that promises were unbreakable. Elena learned to measure time by his routines: breakfast before school, homework at the kitchen table, dinner just warm enough to feel like comfort even when it was simple. His father had left early, not with anger or drama, but with distance. He told Elena he wanted more opportunity, more freedom. He promised to send money. He promised to visit. Over time, those promises thinned out, then disappeared. Elena heard later that he had done well for himself. A new career, a new life. She did not follow it closely. There was no space in her days for bitterness. Some nights, after Lucas was asleep, Elena sat at the small table near the window with a scrap of paper and a pen. She wrote herself notes, simple sentences. You showed up today. You kept him safe. You are doing your best. She folded the notes and tucked them into a drawer she rarely opened. They were not meant to be reread. They were meant to steady her in the moment. She took pride in things no one applauded. Clean clothes folded neatly, shoes lined up by the door, a lunch packed carefully so Lucas would not feel different from other kids. She hummed softly while cooking even when she was too tired to stand straight because Lucas liked the sound. At night, she sat on the edge of his bed and made small promises. Tomorrow will be better. I am here. I am not going anywhere. Those words were never said loudly. They did not need to be. They became the foundation of his world, built quietly, one exhausted day at a time. Elena learned quickly how to make exhaustion invisible. At the community center, she kept her head down and her movement steady, never rushing, never lingering. She memorized which offices needed extra care and which rooms would be used again early in the morning. She noticed details others ignored: a chair left crooked, a coffee stain missed by the last crew. She fixed them quietly, not because she expected praise, but because order gave her a sense of control in a life that offered very little of it. There were nights when her body begged her to stop, when her lower back ached so deeply that standing straight felt like an act of defiance. She would pause for a moment, one hand resting on the handle of her cart, eyes closed, breathing slowly until the pain dulled enough to keep going. She thought of Lucas sleeping at home. That thought always worked better than rest. Money was always tight. Every bill was calculated, every purchase weighed. Elena became skilled at stretching meals without making them feel small. She learned which stores marked down produce late in the evening and which brands tasted the same for less. She never spoke about sacrifice. She framed everything as choice. Lucas did not need to know what she gave up. He only needed to feel secure. When school events came around, Elena rearranged shifts or begged favors so she could be there. Sitting on folding chairs in overheated rooms, clapping too loudly during small performances, smiling even when her eyes burned from lack of sleep. Lucas always searched for her in the crowd first. When he found her, his shoulders relaxed. That was enough. She avoided talking about his father unless Lucas asked. When he did, she answered carefully, honestly, but gently. She refused to turn absence into bitterness. She told Lucas that people sometimes make choices they cannot undo, that it did not mean he was unwanted, that love was proven by staying, by showing up again and again. Late at night, after the apartment settled into silence, Elena sometimes allowed herself a few quiet tears, not of despair, but release. She wiped her face quickly, then returned to her notes. Writing helped her hold herself together. It reminded her that effort mattered even if no one else measured it. At the community center, she became a familiar but overlooked presence. People nodded politely, rarely learning her name. She did not mind. Being invisible meant fewer questions, fewer complications. Once, during a fundraising event, she stayed late to clean after volunteers left. A man had thanked her simply for her work, looking her in the eye. The moment stayed with her longer than she expected. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was rare. Elena never imagined her life would one day be reduced to arguments and files. She believed consistency would protect her. That love applied daily was enough to keep her family intact. She did not know that years later everything she had built quietly would be questioned in a room where exhaustion and devotion carried no official weight. But back then, before the court and the silence and the fear, her world was simple. Work, home, a child who trusted her completely, and the unshakable belief that doing her best, even unseen, had value. As Lucas grew older, Elena adjusted without complaint. His shoes became larger, his questions became harder, the nights became shorter. She learned how to listen even when her mind was fogged with fatigue, nodding, asking gentle follow-up questions, making him feel heard when she barely had the strength to stay awake. She never let him see how close she often was to the edge. There were mornings when she woke before her alarm heart already racing as she calculated the day ahead. Drop Lucas at school, work the morning shift, grab a sandwich if there was time, rest her eyes on the bus for a few minutes. Then back to the community center after dark. Her life moved in cycles, each one designed around keeping him safe and steady. She kept a small routine just for herself. Every Sunday night, before preparing for the week, she folded laundry slowly and deliberately, smoothing each shirt, each pair of socks. It calmed her. It reminded her that order could still exist, even when the future felt uncertain. Sometimes she slipped one of her handwritten notes into her pocket before leaving for work. Not to read, just to know it was there. Lucas sensed her strength without understanding its cost. To him, she was simply there, always. When he woke from bad dreams, she came. When he struggled with school, she sat beside him until he understood. When he laughed, she laughed too, even if her body begged for rest. She taught him manners, patience, and empathy through example, never lectures. The world outside their apartment remained indifferent. Bills arrived on time. Employers rarely noticed her dedication. The father remained distant, sending occasional messages that grew less frequent over the years. Elena did not chase them. She focused forward. She believed stability came from presence, not promises. She never imagined that her quiet life would one day be examined under harsh lights, that her sacrifices would be weighed against bank accounts, that the years she spent holding everything together would be questioned by people who had never wiped a table at midnight or whispered reassurance to a frightened child. In her mind, she had already won something far more important than a case. She had raised a boy who felt safe, who trusted deeply, who believed that love was shown through action. That belief became the core of who he was. And it was that unseen history, built one ordinary night at a time, that would soon be tested in a courtroom that knew nothing of warm meals, folded laundry, or quiet promises kept in the dark. Daniel Morales did not walk into the courtroom with anger. He walked in with confidence, the kind that comes from preparation, from knowing the system speaks your language. His suit was tailored, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral. He nodded politely to the court officers, exchanged brief words with his attorneys, then took his place without looking back. To anyone watching, he appeared reasonable, responsible, stable. Years earlier, Daniel had left quietly, not in a storm of accusations or broken furniture, but with calm explanations about opportunity and growth. He said he needed more from life, more than long shifts and a small apartment could offer. He promised Elena he would help. He promised Lucas he would stay connected. Those promises slowly dissolved as his career advanced and his world expanded. Distance became habit. Habit became absence. Success suited Daniel. He learned to speak in outcomes and projections. His life was built on schedules that ran on time and plans that paid off. When he eventually decided to pursue custody, it felt logical to him. He had space, resources, stability as defined by spreadsheets and square footage. He believed he was offering Lucas something better, something measurable. The legal system welcomed that belief. His attorneys spoke fluently in its terms. They presented income statements, property records, school district comparisons. Charts were displayed, timelines were organized. Everything about Daniel's life could be documented, verified, and neatly packaged. It fit the framework perfectly. Elena's life did not. Her long working hours were reframed as absence. Her multiple jobs became instability. Her exhaustion was described as risk. The same sacrifices that had kept Lucas fed and safe were now presented as liabilities. Her attorney objected gently, but the objections struggled to gain traction against the weight of data. Daniel did not interrupt. He listened calmly as his legal team outlined a future for his son that sounded impressive. Private tutors, safer neighborhoods, consistent routines. None of it was false, but none of it mentioned who had packed lunches at dawn or waited up during fevers. Those details had no column. Lucas was referenced by name less and less. He became the child, the minor, the subject. His needs were summarized in bullet points. His emotions were implied but never explored. He stood beside Elena, small and quiet, watching adults discuss him as if he were not in the room. Daniel glanced at his son once briefly. There was no cruelty in his eyes, only distance. He believed this process would work itself out. That reason would prevail. He trusted the structure he had learned to navigate so well. The judge listened carefully. He asked questions rooted in precedent. His focus remained on what could be justified, not what could be felt. He did not dismiss Elena's devotion, but devotion was not something the law knew how to weigh. The imbalance grew heavier with each exchanged sentence. One side spoke with authority reinforced by numbers. The other relied on a lifetime of presence that left no paper trail. This was not a battle of good and evil. It was something colder. A collision between two versions of responsibility where only one was recognized by the system. And, as the arguments continued, it became clear that love, no matter how constant, was at risk of being outmatched by leverage. Daniel's attorneys understood exactly where to press. Their voices were calm, respectful, almost sympathetic as they spoke about Elena. They did not insult her. They did not question her intentions. Instead, they framed her life as a concern, a risk factor. They spoke of irregular schedules, overnight shifts, physical exhaustion. They used words like strain and uncertainty, carefully chosen to sound responsible rather than cruel. They emphasized how often Lucas was alone in the evenings, even though those evenings were spent sleeping safely in his own bed. They pointed out that Elena relied on public transportation, that her income fluctuated, that her housing situation was modest. Each detail, harmless on its own, was stacked methodically until it formed a picture that suggested instability without ever saying the word directly. Daniel sat beside them, hands folded, nodding occasionally when prompted. He trusted them completely. This was their domain. He believed the truth of his preparedness would speak for itself. He did not consider how easily truth could be shaped by perspective. When Elena's attorney attempted to counter the imbalance became more visible. He spoke of dedication, of consistency, of years spent raising Lucas without interruption, but without documents to support every claim. His words sounded thin against the weight of exhibits and records. The courtroom was designed to reward evidence that could be filed, not effort that had been lived. The judge asked clarifying questions, all of them reasonable. Could Elena guarantee fewer night shifts? Could she ensure constant supervision? Could she provide the same educational advantages? Each question was fair on paper. Each one pushed her further into a corner she had been surviving in for years. Elena answered honestly. She did not exaggerate. She did not plead. She acknowledged her limits and spoke about how she managed them. But honesty did not sound as strong as certainty. Her voice carried fatigue, not because she lacked resolve, but because she had been strong for too long. Lucas listened without understanding the language, but sensing the direction. Every time Elena spoke, his shoulders tensed. Every time the attorneys spoke, the room seemed to lean toward them. He felt himself shrinking into the background of his own life. Daniel watched this unfold with a growing sense of inevitability. He believed that winning custody was not an attack on Elena, but a correction. In his mind, love was not enough if it came wrapped in hardship. He told himself that Lucas would adapt. Children always did. He did not consider what adapting might cost. The courtroom rhythm favored him. Speak, present, confirm. Each step reinforced the same conclusion. The system was not designed to judge who had loved more, only who could provide more, according to definitions that rarely changed. By the time the arguments neared their end, the outcome felt almost predetermined. Not because Elena had failed, but because she had never been given the tools the system valued. Her sacrifices had been real, but invisible. Her devotion unquestionable, but undocumented. The power imbalance no longer needed to be stated. It was felt in every pause, every glance toward the bench. This was not a contest of hearts. It was a negotiation of leverage, and leverage in this room spoke louder than love. As the hearing moved closer to its end, the imbalance hardened into something undeniable. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of listening, but of sorting. One life neatly categorized, the other spilling beyond the margins of the forms that defined the case. Daniel's future for Lucas was laid out in clean lines, predictable mornings, quiet streets, structured evenings. It sounded safe. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like something the court could defend. Elena's future was harder to summarize. It existed in moments rather than plans, in routines held together by effort instead of resources, in flexibility born from necessity. None of it translated well when reduced to answers under oath. She stood there knowing that everything she had done right might still count as wrong in this room. The judge leaned back, slightly, fingers pressed together. His questions slowed, not because he had found clarity, but because he had reached the edge of what the law allowed him to ask. He could not weigh devotion. He could not measure sacrifice. He could only compare what was presented in front of him. And what was presented favored one side heavily. Lucas felt the shift even before the adults acknowledged it. The tone of the room changed. The pauses grew longer. The air thicker. He leaned closer to his mother just enough to feel her presence without drawing attention. She noticed and steadied herself, planting her feet firmly on the floor. Whatever happened next, she wanted him to see her standing. Daniel remained composed. He believed this was simply how decisions were made. He did not feel victorious. He felt justified. The system was working the way it was designed to. That belief allowed him to stay distant from the emotional weight gathering in the room. No one spoke about love anymore. The word had vanished from the conversation entirely. What remained were projections and probabilities, risk assessments and forecasts. The child's life was being rearranged by people who spoke carefully enough to never sound unkind. When the judge finally signaled for a brief recess before delivering his ruling, the room exhaled unevenly, some with relief, some with dread. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, not in surrender but in preparation. Daniel straightened his jacket. The attorneys organized their files, confident in the ground they had covered. The imbalance had done its work. It no longer needed to argue. It simply waited. And in that waiting, the case seemed nearly decided. Not because one parent loved more than the other, but because one parent had more leverage in a system that mistook stability for spreadsheets and presence for a liability. No one noticed yet that leverage was about to be challenged by something the law had never learned how to calculate. Keanu Reeves did not plan to be in that courtroom. His schedule that morning had been simple and familiar. A routine visit to a nearby community outreach center, a short conversation with staff, a few quiet handshakes, nothing public, nothing announced. He preferred it that way. After finishing early, he stepped outside, intending to leave when a light rain began to fall. The courthouse across the street offered temporary shelter, nothing more. Inside the building was subdued. Footsteps echoed softly along polished floors. Voices were low-measured, Keanu paused near the entrance, reading a directory, not intending to stay long. Then he heard a bailiff announce a case and noticed a courtroom door still open. Out of simple curiosity and with time to spare, he stepped inside and took a seat in the back row. He chose a spot near the aisle, not because it mattered, but because it was empty. He removed his coat, folded it neatly over his arm, and sat down without drawing attention. No one turned. No whispers followed. In that space, he was just another observer. That suited him. Keanu rested his hands loosely in his lap and leaned back slightly, eyes forward. His posture was calm, open. He listened without judgment as the proceedings continued. The language was formal, procedural, familiar in its detachment. He did not interrupt his own thoughts with opinions. He simply absorbed what was happening the way he always did when he entered spaces that were not his. He noticed the child first, not because the boy was loud or disruptive, but because he was unnaturally still. Children, Keanu knew, rarely held themselves so rigidly unless they were afraid. His gaze lingered there for a moment longer than expected, then shifted back to the front of the room. The lawyer spoke. Papers were referenced. The judge listened. It was all efficient, clean. And yet something about it felt incomplete. Keanu did not know why. He adjusted his position slightly, crossing one ankle over the other, remaining silent. Then the clerk read the mother's name aloud, Elena Morales. The sound of it registered somewhere deeper than reason. Keanu did not react outwardly. His face remained neutral. But something in his chest tightened briefly, the way it does when a half-forgotten memory brushes the surface. The name felt familiar. Not famous, not prominent, familiar in a quieter way. He searched his memory carefully, not forcing it. Years of charity work had introduced him to hundreds of people whose names blended together. Volunteers, staff, parents, faces attached to moments rather than identities. He told himself it was coincidence, that it meant nothing. Still, he found himself looking at the woman more closely now, not staring, just observing. Her posture, the way she held herself steady despite the pressure in the room, the way her attention never fully left the child beside her. There was a practiced strength there, a restraint he recognized. Keanu did not move. He did not speak. He did not signal recognition. He remained what he had intended to be when he walked in, an anonymous presence, a witness. But as the hearing continued and the imbalance he sensed earlier grew heavier, that faint feeling returned, persistent, unsettling, as if the room had brought him there for a reason he did not yet understand. And though he stayed silent, something inside him had begun to listen more closely than before. Keanu remained still as the hearing moved forward, letting the rhythm of the room settle around him. He had learned long ago that silence could reveal more than questions. He listened to how the attorneys spoke, not just to what they said. He noticed the precision in their tone, the confidence that came from knowing the system would carry their words forward. He noticed how the judge responded with measured patience, bound to the language of procedure rather than emotion. His eyes returned to the child without conscious effort. The boy stood close to his mother, close enough to feel her presence, but not close enough to touch her. Keanu recognized that distance. It was the kind created by rules, not by choice. The child's face was serious beyond his years, his attention fixed on the adults, as if trying to understand a world that had suddenly become too complicated. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, resting his elbows lightly on the armrests. Fingers relaxed. His breathing remained slow and even. Outwardly, there was nothing remarkable about him. Inside, however, the faint pull of recognition refused to fade. The name echoed quietly in his thoughts. Elena Morales. He did not yet know why it mattered, only that it did. As Elena's attorney spoke, Keanu watched her closely. He noticed how she listened more than she spoke, how she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, when her lawyer made a point on her behalf, how she did not interrupt even when the arguments against her seemed to press in from all sides. There was discipline in her stillness, a strength that did not demand attention. Keanu had seen that kind of restraint before, in people who worked long hours without acknowledgement, in parents who carried entire households quietly on their backs. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself, but it endured. The name surfaced again this time, tugging loose a fragment of memory. Late evenings, a community building emptied of noise, the smell of cleaning solution lingering in hallways after programs ended, a woman pushing a cart, moving carefully so as not to disturb anyone. He could not yet see her face clearly in his mind, but the feeling was there. Gratitude, humility, something handwritten. Keanu lowered his gaze briefly, grounding himself, then looked back up. He did not want to jump to conclusions. He did not want to impose meaning where there might be none. He respected the boundary between memory and assumption. So he waited. The hearing continued. Questions were asked, answers given. Each exchange felt increasingly lopsided. Keanu felt no urge to intervene. Not yet. This was not his place. He was here by chance, nothing more. He reminded himself of that. And yet he could not ignore the way the mother's focus never wavered from her child. Even as lawyers spoke about her, she remained anchored to him. It was not fear that held her there. It was commitment, the kind that did not require an audience. Keanu's presence remained unnoticed. No one turned to look at him. No one whispered. He preferred it that way. Fame had taught him that anonymity was a gift, especially in moments that did not belong to him. But as the imbalance in the room deepened, and the mother's name was repeated again in a tone that felt increasingly detached from her humanity, Keanu felt something settle quietly inside him. He was still an observer, still silent, but no longer untouched by what he was witnessing. As the judge called for a short pause to review the arguments, Keanu remained seated, unmoving. People around him shifted in their chairs, whispered to attorneys, adjusted jackets and files. He did none of that. His attention stayed forward steady, as if he were afraid that moving too much might break the fragile balance of the moment. The name echoed again in his mind, softer now, but clearer. Elena Morales. It was no longer just a sound, it carried weight. He remembered a quiet thank you spoken years ago in a place where gratitude was rarely voiced. He remembered tired eyes that still held dignity, a presence that asked for nothing but respect. The memory did not arrive all at once. It surfaced slowly like something patient that had waited to be recognized. Keanu did not look down at his hands. He did not reach into his coat. Not yet. He stayed exactly where he was, allowing the connection to exist without acting on it. He knew how dangerous assumptions could be. He also knew when something deserved attention. Across the room, Elena exhaled slowly, unaware of the shift taking place behind her. She remained focused on her son on the floor, beneath her feet, on holding herself together. She did not know she had been seen, not as a case, not as a liability, but as a person. The judge signaled that proceedings would resume shortly. Chairs straightened, voices quieted, the room reset itself for what everyone assumed would be the final stretch. Keanu's expression did not change. He was still just a man sitting in the back row, unnoticed and silent, but the courtroom no longer felt accidental. And though he had not come there with intention, he understood now that he was no longer there by chance alone. Keanu told himself not to overthink it. Names repeated themselves in the world, faces blurred together over time. Charity work had taken him through hundreds of buildings, thousands of conversations, most of them brief and unremarkable on the surface. It was easy to mistake familiarity for coincidence. He had learned to be careful with memory, to respect its imperfections. Still, the feeling would not leave. He watched Elena again, more deliberately now. Not staring, not intruding, just observing the small details that rarely appeared in official records. The way she positioned herself slightly in front of her son, even when no one asked her to. The way her shoulders squared whenever a lawyer's tone sharpened, as if absorbing the pressure so the child would not have to. The way her jaw tightened, then relaxed each time his name was mentioned. There was restraint in her movements, a practiced stillness. She did not fidget. She did not argue unnecessarily. She listened, waited, endured. Keanu recognized that posture. It belonged to people who had learned that reacting too quickly could cost them something important. People who survived by staying composed. His memory drifted backward without warning. Long hallways late at night, fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead, the smell of disinfectant mixed with old carpet. He remembered walking through community centers after events had ended, the noise gone, the energy drained from the space. That was when he usually met the people no one else noticed. Cleaning crews moving quietly, careful not to disturb. Mothers and fathers working second or third shifts, pushing carts, wiping surfaces already clean enough. Faces that carried fatigue without complaint. Conversations that were brief but sincere. Thank yous exchanged without ceremony. He remembered one woman in particular, though the image was still incomplete. A tired smile, a calm voice, a presence that felt grounded despite obvious exhaustion. She had thanked him once simply for acknowledging her, for treating her like she belonged in the same room. It had stayed with him longer than most encounters, though he had never known why. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, his attention returning fully to the present. He searched Elena's face again, quietly, comparing it to the memory forming in his mind. The years would have changed her. Stress would have aged her beyond her time. It was possible that he was projecting something that was not there. He did not want to be wrong. Being wrong would mean inserting himself into a story that was not his. It would mean confusing sympathy with recognition. He respected boundaries too much for that. He respected her too much. So he did nothing. He listened. He watched. He let the uncertainty exist without forcing it into clarity. He reminded himself that the outcome of this case did not depend on his impressions. That his role, if he had one at all, was to remain a witness and nothing more. But the longer he observed Elena, the harder it became to dismiss the sense of familiarity. It was not her face alone. It was the way she carried responsibility, the way she stayed present for her child, even while the room discussed her failures. Keanu felt a quiet tension settle in his chest. Not urgency, not panic, just awareness. He did not yet know who she was to him. He only knew that she felt known. Keanu tried to anchor himself in the present, but memory has its own rhythm. It does not arrive when invited. It arrives when something opens the door. The courtroom, with its stripped-down seriousness, had done exactly that. The quiet, the stillness, the sense that something important was being weighed without the right tools. He remembered how those late nights used to feel, walking through nearly empty buildings after charity events when the applause was gone and only work remained. He remembered how different the space felt then, honest, unguarded. That was when people spoke more freely, if they spoke at all. That was when he learned the most about the lives that kept those places running. He remembered hands rough from cleaning solutions, backs bent from long hours, eyes that learned to stay alert even when the body begged for rest. People who did not expect to be noticed, and so were often surprised when they were. He had learned to slow down in those moments, to listen, to treat presence as something intentional. Elena's presence felt like that. He watched how she angled her body whenever the attorneys leaned forward, how she seemed to absorb the tension of the room and redirect it away from her son. She did not argue emotionally. She did not plead. She carried herself the way someone does when they have already endured worse than judgment. The courtroom was only another room where she had to remain steady. Keanu's thoughts returned again to that fragment of memory. A handwritten note, folded carefully, words chosen with care, not elegance. Gratitude expressed without expectation. He could almost feel the texture of the paper thin from being handled, creased from being folded and unfolded. He remembered keeping it not because he collected praise, but because it reminded him why quiet work mattered. He did not yet remember the name on that letter. That detail remained just out of reach, but the emotional shape of it matched what he was seeing now. The same quiet dignity, the same sense of someone doing more than anyone realized. He questioned himself again. Memory was unreliable, time distorted things. He had seen hundreds of similar faces. It was possible he wanted this connection to exist because the situation felt unfair, because the imbalance in the room disturbed him. Wanting meaning did not make it true. Keanu had learned through experience that assuming recognition could be a form of disrespect. It could turn someone else's life into a reflection of his own narrative. He did not want that. He did not want to reduce Elena to a memory or to a reason for him to act, so he stayed where he was. He breathed evenly. He kept his posture relaxed. He allowed the uncertainty to remain unresolved. That, too, was a form of respect. But even as he tried to maintain distance, he could not ignore how the room responded to Elena, or rather how it failed to. The language used about her grew increasingly abstract. She became a concept instead of a person, a variable instead of a mother. Keanu felt something tighten again, not sharply but firmly, a sense of responsibility that had nothing to do with celebrity or influence. It had everything to do with witnessing something incomplete. He did not yet know what that meant. He only knew that the feeling would not let him look away, and that the longer he watched, the less this felt like coincidence, and the more it felt like memory asking to be trusted even before it was fully understood. Keanu allowed his gaze to rest on Elena one more time, not searching for confirmation now, but for truth. Not who she might have been years ago, but who she was in this moment. A mother standing in a room that did not speak her language. A woman holding herself together while others spoke about her as if she were not there. He noticed the smallest details, how her hand hovered near her son's shoulder without touching him, offering reassurance without breaking court rules. How she breathed in slowly before answering questions, choosing calm over defense. How she nodded once when something was said that she knew she could not change. These were not the habits of someone careless or unstable. They were the habits of someone practiced in endurance. The uncertainty inside him settled into something quieter, not doubt, but patience. He did not need to force recognition. He did not need to name the memory yet. He trusted that if it mattered, it would surface in its own time. Keanu leaned back slightly, grounding himself in the chair. He reminded himself why he had always approached moments like this with restraint. Because people deserved to be seen for who they were, now not who they reminded him of. Because intervention without clarity could do more harm than good, and yet the feeling remained. Steady, insistent, not demanding action, but awareness. He understood then that recognition did not always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it came as responsibility without explanation, as a quiet knowing that something unfolding in front of you was not complete. He did not know yet what role, if any, he would play in this story. But he knew one thing with clarity. He was no longer just watching a custody hearing. He was watching a truth struggle to surface in a room that did not yet know how to hear it. When the hearing resumed, the tone of the room shifted almost immediately. The brief pause had not softened anything. If anything, it had sharpened the edges. The judge straightened in his chair, his voice measured and formal as he summarized what had already been presented. His words carried the weight of procedure, not opinion. He was careful, precise. Every sentence sounded like something he had said many times before. Legal precedent was cited again, this time with more emphasis. Similar cases, established outcomes, guidelines that left little room for interpretation. The father's attorneys nodded as each point landed, confident in the ground they had prepared. They spoke again briefly, reinforcing what was already clear. Their arguments did not need passion. They had structure. They had history on their side. Elena felt the air thin around her. She listened closely, but the words began to blur together. Stability, capacity, best interest. Each phrase sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed something heavy and unavoidable. She had heard versions of this language before in meetings with social workers, in letters she did not fully understand. It always ended the same way, with her having to prove what she lived every day. Her attorney stood and tried again. He spoke about consistency, about years of uninterrupted care, about a child who had never missed school, never gone hungry, never been abandoned. His voice was sincere, but it wavered slightly as he moved from one point to the next. There was no new evidence to introduce, no document that could suddenly tip the balance. He was asking the court to see what could not be filed. The judge listened, nodding occasionally, but his questions grew fewer. When he did speak, his responses were careful and restrained. He acknowledged the mother's efforts. He acknowledged her dedication. But acknowledgement was not the same as authority. Each time he returned to the language of precedent, Elena felt herself slipping further away from the outcome she hoped for. Lucas sensed the shift before anyone explained it. He felt it in the way his mother's breathing changed, in the way her shoulders stiffened. He reached out without thinking and caught the edge of her sleeve, gripping it tightly between his fingers. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was instinct. A child holding on to the one thing that still felt solid. Elena noticed immediately. She did not look down at him. She did not move. She simply let her arm stay where it was steady and warm. Her jaw tightened as she focused on standing upright, on not reacting, on not giving the room another reason to question her composure. The father remained silent. He watched the exchange with a calm expression, trusting the process as it unfolded. To him, this was moving as expected. Difficult, but necessary. He did not see himself as taking something away. He believed he was offering something better. The judge took a breath and looked down at his notes once more. The room waited. The sound of paper shifting felt louder than it should have. Then, in a voice that carried finality without cruelty, the judge announced that he would call for a short recess before delivering his ruling. Chairs shifted. People exhaled. Elena closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She did not need to hear the decision to understand what was coming, and neither did the child holding her sleeve. The recess did not bring relief. It only stretched the tension thinner, like a thread pulled too tight. People stood, adjusted their positions, murmured quietly with attorneys. The judge remained on the bench for a moment, scanning his notes one last time before stepping away. His expression revealed nothing but the formality of his posture made one thing clear. His mind was already moving toward a conclusion shaped by rules, not feelings. Elena stayed where she was. She did not sit. She did not pace. She kept her eyes forward, her body still, as if movement itself might be interpreted as uncertainty. Inside, everything felt loud. Her thoughts raced, replaying years of effort, as if listing them silently could somehow make them count. Every late night, every sacrifice, every moment she chose her son over rest, over comfort, over herself. Her attorney leaned in briefly and spoke in a low voice, offering reassurance that sounded practiced but fragile. He reminded her that they had made their case, that the judge had listened, that sometimes the court surprised people. Elena nodded politely, but she did not respond. She had learned to recognize the difference between hope and kindness. This felt like the latter. Lucas remained pressed close to her side, his fingers still curled into her sleeve. He did not ask questions. He did not cry. He simply stayed there, drawing comfort from contact alone. His eyes followed the adults around the room, sensing that something important was being decided without him. He did not understand the words, but he understood the weight. Daniel stood near his attorneys, speaking quietly with them. Their tone was confident, almost casual. They reviewed points already made, anticipating no further challenges. Daniel listened, nodding once or twice. He felt the weight of responsibility, but not doubt. The process was unfolding as it should. He believed that when the ruling came, it would be defended easily, supported by precedent, protected by structure. Keanu remained seated in the back row. He watched the recess unfold with the same restraint he had shown all morning. He did not speak to anyone. He did not check his phone. His attention stayed on the center of the room, where a mother and child stood waiting for something they could not control. The imbalance felt sharper now, no longer abstract, but imminent. When the judge returned, the room snapped back into order. Conversations ended abruptly. Chairs scraped softly as people settled. Elena straightened instinctively. Lucas's grip tightened for a brief moment before he released it, standing still beside her. The judge took his seat and adjusted his glasses. His voice when he spoke was even more formal than before. He explained that he had reviewed the evidence, the arguments, and the relevant case law. He thanked both sides for their professionalism. Each phrase sounded like a step closer to an ending Elena did not want to hear. Her attorney shifted slightly as if preparing for one last effort, then seemed to think better of it. There was nothing left to add. Everything that could be said had already been said, and still it was not enough. The judge paused, looking down at the file again. The room leaned forward, collectively bracing for the ruling that would change everything. Instead, he stopped. He looked up and announced that before delivering his decision, he would take a final brief recess to ensure his ruling was as thorough as possible. The words landed softly, but their impact was heavy. This pause was not hope. It was the calm before an outcome that felt all but decided. The second recess felt heavier than the first, not because anything new had happened, but because nothing could. The room seemed to understand that the window for change had nearly closed. People waited with the quiet acceptance that comes when outcomes are shaped elsewhere, beyond words or effort. Elena felt the realization settle fully now, not as panic, but as clarity. She was losing, not because she had failed, but because the rules had been written for a different kind of life. She kept her chin lifted, refusing to let the moment take her posture as well as her hope. She focused on breathing. In, out, steady. She wanted Lucas to remember her like this. Standing, present, unbroken. Lucas felt it too, though he could not name it. The adults had stopped talking. The room had grown still in a way that felt final. He stepped closer to his mother again, pressing his side against her leg. This time he wrapped his hand around her wrist, holding on more firmly. She responded by gently curling her fingers around his, grounding them both. Daniel remained composed, but a subtle shift passed through him as well. Anticipation. The knowledge that a line was about to be crossed, one that could not be uncrossed. He told himself again that this was necessary, that this was right. Keanu watched without moving. The tension in the room sharpened his focus, narrowing everything down to the mother, the child, and the space between them. The law was closing in now, not loudly, not cruelly, but with certainty. When the judge finally returned to the bench, the room straightened in unison. The air felt tight, expectant, and everyone knew that whatever came next would change the shape of that child's life forever. When the judge called the recess, Keanu finally stood. Not abruptly, not with urgency. He rose the way someone does when they need air, when staying seated feels heavier than moving. He stepped quietly into the hallway just outside the courtroom, where the noise softened and the tension loosened its grip, if only slightly. The hallway smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. Footsteps echoed at a distance, but no one paid him any attention. He leaned lightly against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment, allowing the weight in his chest to settle. The memory that had been circling him all morning no longer stayed vague. It pressed forward, insistent, asking to be acknowledged. Without fully thinking, his hand moved to the inside pocket of his coat. His fingers brushed against something familiar. Thin, folded, worn soft by time. The letter. He had carried it for years without intention. Not as a keepsake meant to be shown, and not as a reminder meant to be revisited often. It had simply stayed with him, migrating from jacket to jacket, surviving moves, tours, and seasons of life. Sometimes he forgot it was there. Sometimes he felt it, and remembered exactly why it mattered. He pulled it out slowly now, not unfolding it yet, just holding it between his fingers. The paper was creased along the same lines it always had been folded carefully, by someone who had wanted it to fit neatly into an envelope. He remembered the moment he had received it. It had been late, a community center nearly empty after a long event. Most people had gone home. He had been thanking volunteers when he noticed a woman still cleaning, moving quietly down a hallway, careful not to interrupt. He had stopped, said thank you to her as well. Not in passing, not distracted. He had looked at her and meant it. She had seemed surprised. Not emotional, just surprised, as if gratitude directed at her was unexpected. A few days later, the letter arrived. Keanu's memory sharpened as he stood in the hallway now. He could see the handwriting clearly in his mind, slightly uneven, careful, as if each word had been chosen slowly. The letter had not praised him. It had not asked for anything. It had simply said, "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for treating me like a human being." One line had stayed with him more than the rest. "My child was watching. And because of you, he learned something important." Keanu exhaled slowly, his thumb tracing the edge of the folded paper. The words echoed now louder than they had when he first read them. Child, watching, learning. His eyes opened. The image of the boy in the courtroom rose instantly in his mind. The way he stood so still, the way he clung to his mother's sleeve, the way he watched every adult absorbing everything. Keanu felt the final piece slide into place. The posture, the restraint, the quiet dignity, the name. Elena Morales. His grip on the letter tightened slightly, not out of panic, but recognition. Not the uncertain familiarity from before, but something solid, grounded, real. The woman standing in that courtroom was no longer just someone he felt he might know. She was the woman who had written this letter. And suddenly the silence in the courtroom made sense, in a way it never had before. Keanu unfolded the letter slowly, carefully, as if the paper itself deserved patience. The hallway around him faded. The courthouse sounds became distant, replaced by the steady rhythm of his own breathing. His eyes moved across the page, though he already knew the words by heart. The handwriting was exactly as he remembered. Neat, but slightly slanted, shaped by someone who did not write, often someone who wanted to get it right. There were no flourishes, no dramatic phrases, just honesty laid down line by line. She had written about working nights, about cleaning rooms that filled with people during the day and emptied into silence by evening. She had written about being tired but grateful, about how rare it felt to be acknowledged by name instead of function. She had written that his simple thank you had stayed with her longer than he could imagine. And then there was the part that returned to him now with clarity he could not ignore. She had written about her son. She had explained that he sometimes waited for her at the community center when childcare fell through, that he sat quietly in a corner with a book while she worked, that he watched how people spoke to her, how they looked past her, how some treated her as invisible. She had written that night that when Keanu stopped and thanked her, when he met her eyes and spoke with respect, her son had noticed. "My child was watching," she had written. And because of that moment, he learned that dignity does not depend on position. Keanu lowered the letter slightly, his throat tight. The words landed differently now, not as a reflection of a moment long past, but as a bridge between then and now. The child in that letter was no longer a small boy waiting in a hallway. He was standing in a courtroom watching adults decide his future. The memory expanded further. He remembered her voice now, calm, soft, not apologetic. He remembered the way she had thanked him in person, afterward embarrassed, almost as if she felt she had said too much. He remembered telling her that she mattered not because of where she worked, but because of who she was. At the time, it had felt like a simple exchange, one of many. He had never imagined it would follow him this far. Keanu folded the letter again, slowly, deliberately. His hand trembled just slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding. This was not coincidence. This was continuity. A moment of dignity offered years ago, now intersecting with a moment of judgment. He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes briefly. The image of Elena in the courtroom rose again. Her stillness, her restraint, her refusal to collapse even as the system closed in around her. It matched the woman who had written the letter perfectly. This was not about gratitude anymore. This was about truth. He understood now why the memory had refused to stay buried, why the name had echoed, why the silence in the courtroom had felt unbearable. The law was about to erase a story it had never learned how to read. Keanu opened his eyes. The letter rested securely in his hand. And for the first time since entering the courthouse, he understood that he was no longer just a witness to what was happening. He was carrying proof of something the law could not document, but justice could not ignore. Keanu slipped the folded letter back into his coat pocket, but it no longer felt like an object he carried by habit. It felt deliberate now, anchored, as if it had waited years for this exact moment to be needed again. His hand lingered over the pocket for a second longer, not checking that it was there, but acknowledging what it represented. Everything aligned with unsettling clarity. The late nights she had written about, the child watching quietly from corners, the dignity she had tried to protect in a world that rarely offered it. All of it stood now in a courtroom preparing to measure her worth by numbers that ignored her story entirely. Keanu straightened and pushed himself gently away from the wall. His expression remained calm, but something inside him had shifted from observation to resolve. Not urgency, not anger, just certainty, the kind that arrives when memory and present truth finally meet. He thought about the line she had written again. "My child was watching. And because of you, he learned something important." That sentence no longer belonged to the past. It was happening again right now in a different room under harsher lights. Keanu knew he could still walk away. The recess had not ended yet. No one expected anything from him. He had not been called. He had no obligation. The system would continue without him efficiently, impersonally. But he also knew something else. If he stayed silent now, the lesson that child would learn would be very different. He took a slow breath and turned back toward the courtroom doors. The hallway felt narrower than before, not because of fear, but because of purpose. He did not yet know how he would speak or whether he would be allowed to. He only knew that the letter in his pocket had not survived all these years by accident, and that whatever happened next, he could no longer pretend this moment did not belong to him too. Keanu stopped just outside the courtroom doors. The sounds from inside were muted now, reduced to indistinct movement and low voices as people waited for the judge to return. He stood there, hand resting briefly against his coat, feeling the folded letter beneath the fabric. Its presence felt heavier than paper. It carried memory, context, and something the law had no category for. He knew with complete clarity that the letter meant nothing legally. It was not evidence. It was not testimony. It was not admissible under any standard he understood. Introducing it could be seen as improper, even disruptive. Courts were not built to receive moral artifacts. They were built to process facts. He also knew who he was, or rather who people thought he was. Any movement he made could shift the room in ways he did not intend. Recognition could distort motive. Influence could eclipse truth. He had spent years learning how easily presence could become pressure, even when none was meant. That knowledge made him hesitate. This was not his story. It never had been. He did not want to step into a space where his name mattered more than the truth he carried. He did not want a judge to feel watched or a courtroom to lean because of who was speaking rather than what was being said. The thought unsettled him deeply. Justice, if it came, had to come cleanly. Keanu exhaled slowly and looked through the narrow window in the courtroom door. Elena was seated now, finally, not because she was tired, though she was, but because standing had become unnecessary. The decision felt close enough to touch. She sat with her hands folded loosely in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor, as if grounding herself to something solid. Lucas sat beside her, knees pulled in slightly, his foot tapping once before he stilled it. They were alone in the middle of the room, despite the people around them. Keanu watched without moving. He saw the loneliness of it. Not dramatic, not loud, just absolute. A woman who had spent her life being strong quietly, now waiting to be told whether that strength counted. A child learning in real time what the world did when rules collided with care. Keanu felt the weight of choice settle in fully now. This was not about doing something heroic. It was about deciding whether silence was still acceptable, whether witnessing something wrong carried responsibility beyond observation. He reminded himself again of humility, of restraint, of the many times he had chosen not to speak because speaking would not help. He had learned that intervention was not always virtue. Sometimes it was intrusion, but this felt different. He was not being asked to speak for Elena. He was not being asked to challenge the law. He was being asked quietly and internally whether he would allow a truth he held to disappear simply because it did not fit the room. The letter had not been written for a courtroom. It had been written for dignity, for a child, for the record of humanity that existed outside legal files. Carrying it now, Keanu understood that ignoring it would be a choice as well, a choice to protect process over people. He did not want recognition. He did not want thanks. He did not want to be remembered for this moment. In fact, he wanted the opposite. He wanted the letter to matter more than the person holding it. Keanu straightened slightly, then stopped himself. Not yet. He needed to be sure. He needed to know that if he stood, it would not be because he could, but because he must. And as he watched Elena lift her head just enough to glance at her son, offering him a small, brave smile, she did not feel that certainty began to take shape. This was not a decision being made by a celebrity. It was being made by a witness who had seen this story begin years earlier in a quiet hallway when no one else was watching. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment and let the noise inside his head settle. He reminded himself that courts functioned on boundaries for a reason. Without them, fairness collapsed into chaos. Judges were not meant to be persuaded by sentiment. They were meant to weigh facts, apply precedent, and protect process. He respected that deeply. He imagined standing up and immediately saw the risks. The shift in attention, the sudden awareness of who he was, the way faces would turn not toward the letter, but toward him. That was not justice. That was distortion. And he had spent a lifetime avoiding exactly that. He thought of the judge already burdened by limitation. Adding pressure, even unintentionally, could undermine the very fairness he hoped to preserve. He thought of Elena too. If this went wrong, if the gesture backfired, it could hurt her more than help her. The thought made his chest tighten. Keanu looked again through the glass. Elena was still seated. Her posture controlled her expression, composed in the way only someone long practiced in disappointment could manage. She was not asking for rescue. She was bracing herself. That mattered. Lucas leaned closer to her now, resting his head briefly against her arm. She shifted slightly enough to support him, not enough to draw attention. The gesture was small, instinctive, full of care. It carried no argument, no evidence, and yet it said everything. Keanu felt the question resolve inside him. This was not about altering the ruling. It was about offering the court a fuller truth without demanding anything in return. The letter did not ask for custody. It did not accuse anyone. It simply testified to character, to dignity, to a life lived responsibly when no one was counting. He understood then that silence was no longer neutral. Silence would allow the record to remain incomplete. Speaking would not guarantee justice, but it would honor truth. Keanu opened his eyes. His decision did not feel bold. It felt quiet, grounded, necessary. He would not stand as someone important. He would stand as someone who remembered, and that memory, once acknowledged, refused to let him step back into comfortable distance again today. When the judge returned to the bench, the courtroom rose and settled again in practiced unison. The air felt tighter than before, as if the room itself understood that whatever came next would not be undone. Papers were aligned. Pens were readied. Elena straightened her back instinctively while Lucas stayed close, his shoulder brushing her arm. The judge cleared his throat and began to speak, his tone formal, careful, already moving toward conclusion. That was when Keanu stood. He did not rise abruptly. There was no scrape of the chair, no urgency in the movement. He stood the way someone does when they are unsure they should interrupt, but know they cannot remain seated. The motion was subtle, almost hesitant, but it cut through the room with unexpected force. A few heads turned, then more. The judge paused mid-sentence, his eyes lifting from the file. Silence spread quickly, rippling outward as attention shifted toward the back row. Elena did not look around. She remained facing forward, unaware of what had changed behind her. Keanu remained standing, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture respectful. He did not announce himself. He did not raise his voice. When he spoke, it was calm and measured, carrying no authority beyond sincerity. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "may I ask permission to speak briefly?" The words landed carefully without assumption. A request, not a demand. A murmur moved through the courtroom, low and uncertain. Some recognized him now. Others sensed that something unusual was happening without understanding why. The attorneys exchanged glances. Daniel turned slightly, confusion flickering across his expression. The judge studied Keanu for a moment, weighing more than procedure. He did not respond immediately. This was not standard. Witnesses had already been heard. Arguments concluded. The court was not accustomed to unscheduled voices at this stage. Keanu continued before the pause could grow uncomfortable. "I want to be clear," he said evenly. "I am not here to testify. I am not part of either legal team. I am not asking for special consideration, and I am not speaking about the legal merits of this case." The judge's expression shifted subtly. Curiosity replaced irritation. He leaned forward slightly, listening. "I am only asking," Keanu continued, "for permission to submit something as a human statement of character, nothing more." The words "human statement" seemed to hang in the air. They did not fit neatly into the language of the courtroom, and that was precisely why they unsettled it. One of the attorneys rose halfway from his chair, then hesitated, unsure whether to object. The judge raised a hand, gently signaling patience. He was still listening. Elena felt the change then. The room had gone quiet in a different way. Not the heavy silence of judgment, but the alert stillness of interruption. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see who had spoken. Her breath caught. She did not recognize Keanu as a celebrity first. She recognized him as a presence, as someone familiar in a way she could not yet name. Her confusion mirrored his own earlier uncertainty. The judge adjusted his glasses and spoke carefully. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his tone cautious but respectful. "This court operates on procedure. You understand that what you are proposing carries no legal weight." "I understand completely," Keanu replied without hesitation. "I am not asking it to." Another pause followed, longer this time. The judge glanced down at the file, then back up at Keanu. The room waited suspended between rule and discretion. And in that hesitation, the direction of the case, once so certain, began to waver, if only by a fraction. The judge remained silent, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the bench. He had heard many requests in his career, but few like this. The courtroom watched him closely now, waiting to see which direction he would choose. Procedure offered safety, discretion carried risk. One of the attorneys cleared his throat, rising to object. The judge raised his hand again, firmer this time, signaling that he would decide whether an objection was even necessary. His eyes stayed on Keanu. "You are asking this court," the judge said slowly, "to allow something outside the record." "Yes, Your Honor," Keanu replied. His voice did not waver. Outside the record, but not outside the truth. That answer caused another ripple through the room. Quiet murmurs surfaced again, then faded as quickly as they appeared. Daniel shifted in place, uncertainty replacing his earlier confidence. He glanced toward Elena, then back to the man standing behind her. He could not yet understand why this moment felt heavier than all the arguments that had come before it. Elena turned fully now. She looked at Keanu, searching his face. Recognition stirred faintly, mixed with disbelief. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply watched her heart pounding with questions she did not yet dare to ask. The judge leaned back slightly, considering. His role was not to reward emotion, but neither was it to pretend humanity had no place in the room. He had already reached the limits of the law in this case. He knew that. Perhaps that was why he did not dismiss the request outright. "What you offer," the judge said carefully, "cannot influence the ruling as evidence." "I am aware," Keanu said. "I only ask that it be heard, or read, without argument, without response." The judge studied him again, this time longer. He was weighing tone as much as content. Keanu was not pressing, not persuading. He was standing still, waiting, willing to accept refusal without protest. That restraint mattered. The judge looked down at the case file once more. He then looked at Elena, at the child beside her, at the space between them. He exhaled slowly, a sound that carried more fatigue than frustration. "This court," he said at last, "does not often allow such deviations." Keanu nodded once. "I understand." Another pause, the longest yet. Then the judge spoke again. "However," he said, choosing the word with care, "this court also recognizes that character is not always captured by documentation alone." The room went completely still. The judge's gaze returned to Keanu. "You may proceed," he said, briefly. No gavel struck, no dramatic announcement followed. Just permission. And in that quiet allowance, the courtroom crossed from certainty into something far more fragile. Possibility. Keanu reached slowly into his coat pocket. The movement was deliberate, careful, as if he were handling something fragile. He did not look at Elena. He did not look at the child. He kept his eyes lowered, focused on the simple act of removing the folded paper he had carried for years. He held it for a moment in both hands, not opening it, not displaying it, just holding it. Then he stepped forward and extended the letter toward the bailiff. "I won't read it," Keanu said quietly, "and I won't explain it. I only ask that the court see it exactly as it was written." The bailiff accepted the letter with a nod, sensing the gravity of the moment. The paper looked ordinary, slightly worn, creased along familiar folds. Nothing about it suggested power or importance. And yet the room felt as though something weighty had been placed into motion. The bailiff walked it to the bench. The judge accepted the letter without comment. He did not open it immediately. He studied it first, noticing the handwriting visible through the thin paper. Not typed, not formatted, no letterhead, just ink placed carefully by hand. When he unfolded it, the sound of paper moving echoed softly in the quiet courtroom. The judge began to read, silently. No one spoke, no one shifted. Even the attorneys seemed to understand that this was not a moment for interruption. The words on the page were not being introduced as argument. They were not meant to be challenged. They simply existed. The judge's eyes moved steadily across the lines. His expression was neutral at first, professional. Then gradually something changed. His brow tightened slightly. His lips pressed together, not in displeasure, but concentration. He paused once, just long enough to reread a line before continuing. No one else could hear the words, but their presence began to shape the room. They spoke of late nights, cleaning empty halls, of mopping floors long after others had gone home, of raising a child alone while working multiple jobs, of gratitude not for charity but for dignity, for being seen. There were no accusations in the letter, no mention of courts or custody or injustice. No pleas, no demands, just an account of a life lived quietly and responsibly, and a thank you offered without expectation. The judge read on. Across the room, Elena stood frozen. She had not yet realized what was being read, only that something deeply unfamiliar was unfolding. Her heart pounded. Her hands trembled faintly at her sides. She recognized nothing yet, but she felt something. A presence. A memory stirring just beneath awareness. Lucas watched the judge's face intently. He did not know why the adults had gone so quiet, but he sensed importance. The judge's eyes no longer skimmed documents. They lingered. They absorbed. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This was not part of the process, he understood. He did not know what the letter said, but he could feel the attention in the room, changing direction, pulling away from charts and timelines and towards something he could not measure. The judge reached the end of the letter and did not immediately look up. He held the paper in his hands, resting it lightly on the bench, as if setting it down too quickly might diminish its weight. The courtroom waited, not for a ruling, but for understanding. The judge lifted his eyes slowly from the page. For a moment he did not speak. His gaze moved across the courtroom, not landing on any one person for long. It was as if he were recalibrating, adjusting his sense of the room after stepping briefly into someone else's life. The change in his expression was subtle, but unmistakable. The rigidity that had defined his posture earlier had softened, not into sympathy. Into consideration? He looked down at the letter again, then folded it carefully along the same lines it had held for years. The care with which he did so did not go unnoticed. This was no longer just a piece of paper to be filed or dismissed. It had been handled as something personal, human. Silence stretched. Elena's breath caught in her throat as understanding finally reached her. She recognized the words without hearing them. She recognized the memory behind them, the late-night exhaustion, the quiet gratitude. The moment she had written that letter at a small table, unsure whether sending it was appropriate, but certain that staying silent felt worse. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. Not yet. She stood there stunned by the sudden collision of past and present, by the realization that something she had written without expectation had found its way back to her when she needed it most. Lucas watched his mother closely now. He noticed the shift in her expression, the way her shoulders trembled just slightly. He did not know why, but he felt it too. The room no longer felt hostile. It felt attentive. The attorneys remained silent. There was nothing to object to, no argument to counter. The letter had made no claims that could be disputed. It had offered no request that could be denied. It existed beyond strategy. Daniel felt something uncomfortable settle in his chest. He did not feel accused. He felt displaced. The narrative he had trusted so completely had been interrupted by a version of truth he had never considered, one that did not fit neatly into his understanding of responsibility. The judge placed the folded letter beside the case file, not inside it. The distinction mattered. He cleared his throat once slowly. "This letter," he said, his voice lower than before, "does not speak to legal entitlement." He paused. "But it speaks clearly to character." The words landed gently, but they shifted everything. He glanced briefly at Keanu, who remained standing quietly, hands at his sides, saying nothing. Then the judge looked at Elena, not as a subject, as a person. The courtroom remained utterly still. No one knew yet how the ruling would change, but everyone understood that the case would never return to what it had been before the letter was read, because something the law had not been able to see had finally been placed in front of it, and it could not be unread. No one spoke. The courtroom had fallen into a stillness unlike anything before it. This was not the tense quiet of waiting for argument, nor the formal pause before a ruling. This silence had weight. It pressed gently but firmly against everyone in the room, leaving no space for interruption. The judge set the folded letter down on the bench with deliberate care. Not quickly, not casually. He placed it beside the case file, not atop it, not inside it. The distinction was subtle but unmistakable. The file contained facts. The letter contained something else. He did not look up right away. The attorneys remained seated, hands resting on their papers, eyes fixed forward. None of them objected. None of them spoke. They had built careers on language, on framing and reframing truth into argument. In this moment, language had nothing to add. Any word would feel intrusive. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, then stopped. His confidence had drained into uncertainty. He stared at the bench, then at the letter, then away again. The room no longer felt structured around him. The leverage he had relied on had not vanished, but it had been interrupted. And that interruption unsettled him more than opposition ever had. Elena stood motionless. She did not yet understand the full shape of what had happened. She knew the letter was hers. She knew it had been read, but she did not yet know what it meant in this room. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Her heart beat too fast. Her fingers tingled. She felt exposed in a way that was not humiliating, but vulnerable. Lucas looked up at her, sensing the shift. He had watched adults speak all morning. He had watched words bounce back and forth over his head. Now there were no words at all, and somehow this felt bigger. He leaned closer to her again, resting his arm against hers. She felt it and steadied herself, grounding both of them. Keanu remained standing silent. He did not move. He did not look toward the judge or the lawyers. His gaze stayed low, respectful, as if the moment no longer belonged to him. He had brought the letter into the room. That was all. Whatever happened next was not his to shape. The judge inhaled slowly, then exhaled. The sound was quiet, but in the stillness it carried. He picked up the letter again, not to read it, but to adjust it slightly, aligning it with care. The gesture spoke volumes. This was not a piece of evidence to be dismissed. It was something to be held with intention. Silence stretched. It did not rush anyone. It did not demand resolution. It allowed space for what could not be spoken. In that space, the story of a woman cleaning floors at night, raising a child with love and asking for nothing but dignity, stood unchallenged. No one argued against it. No one needed to. The silence had become testimony, and it was saying everything the words before it never could. The silence continued, stretching beyond comfort and into something reflective. It invited thought rather than reaction. In that stillness, each person in the room was left alone with what they had heard without hearing a single word spoken aloud. The judge finally lifted his eyes, but he did not speak. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately, first to the attorneys, then to Daniel, then to Elena. He was not assessing arguments anymore. He was measuring impact. The law had brought him this far. The silence was carrying him the rest of the way. Daniel felt the unease deepen. He had entered the courtroom certain that structure and preparation would prevail. He had trusted in documents, in logic, in the idea that fairness was something that could be organized and proven. Now, for the first time, he felt something slip beyond his grasp. Not accusation, not judgment, perspective. And it left him unsettled in a way he could not easily name. He looked at Elena again, really looked at her. Not as an opposing party, not as a variable in a case, but as the woman standing in front of him. He saw the exhaustion she no longer bothered to hide, the restraint she had practiced for years, the way she held herself together for the sake of the child beside her. He did not feel anger. He felt distance narrowing, and that frightened him more than conflict ever had. Elena stood frozen in place, her mind struggling to keep pace with her body. She had written that letter years ago, without expectation. It had never been meant to protect her. It had been meant to express gratitude. Now it sat in front of a judge, carrying her life into a space where she had never believed it belonged. She did not know whether to feel hope or fear. She only knew that something irreversible had happened. Lucas sensed it too. The silence did not scare him. It steadied him. For the first time that day, the room felt like it was listening, not to lawyers, to truth. He straightened slightly, his hand still near his mother's, and waited. The attorneys remained still, their instincts restrained by awareness. There was no motion to break this moment, no objection to file, no response to prepare. They understood that whatever they said now would diminish what had already landed. Keanu finally lowered himself back into his seat. The action was quiet, almost invisible, but it signaled something important. He had done what he came to do. Nothing more, nothing less. He did not look toward Elena. He did not seek acknowledgement. He simply sat and let the silence finish its work. The judge placed both hands flat on the bench, grounding himself. His expression was thoughtful, heavier than before. The pause had given him something the law alone could not provide. Context. This silence was not emptiness. It was testimony without agenda, without strategy, without rebuttal. And in that testimony, the court had heard a truth that could not be cross-examined, dismissed, or forgotten. The silence had spoken. Now the law would have to respond to it. The judge drew a slow breath before speaking. When his voice finally filled the courtroom, it was quieter than before, but steadier, not weakened, clarified. This court, he began, is bound by law. The words landed with familiarity. Everyone in the room had heard versions of them before. The judge acknowledged the framework that governed him, the statutes, the precedents, the obligation to rule not on emotion, but on what could be defended within the system. He spoke of standards meant to protect children from instability, of guidelines designed to ensure safety, continuity, and opportunity. He paused briefly, then continued, but the law, he said, was never meant to be blind to context. His eyes moved from the file to the letter resting beside it, then back up again. The shift was subtle, but intentional. The law relies on documentation, he went on. Income statements, schedules, records that can be verified and repeated. These are necessary tools. They exist for good reason. He looked toward Daniel, then toward Elena, but they are not the full measure of a parent. The room remained silent, attentive, in a way that felt almost reverent now. No one interrupted, no one moved. The judge leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the bench. In reviewing this case, he said, I find no evidence that either parent lacks concern for this child. That matters. However, concern alone is not the standard by which custody is determined. Elena's heart pounded. She kept her face still, afraid that any reaction might disrupt the fragile balance forming in the room. The judge continued, his words deliberate. This court must consider stability, not only financial stability, but emotional and developmental stability. Consistency, presence, the daily reality of care. He gestured subtly toward the space between Elena and Lucas. The evidence shows that this child has spent his life in the consistent care of his mother. That care has not been perfect, but it has been uninterrupted, it has been attentive, and it has been grounded in sacrifice rather than convenience. Daniel shifted slightly but said nothing. The judge straightened. This court also recognizes, he said, that wealth can provide comfort. It can open doors, but wealth alone does not guarantee security, nor does it replace the foundational bond formed through daily presence. He paused, allowing the words to settle. Then he said the line that would echo far beyond the room. Laws have limits, the judge said, but justice has no limits. The sentence did not rise in volume. It did not demand attention. It commanded it. The judge looked directly at Elena now. In this case, he continued, the court finds that the stability of love demonstrated consistently over time outweighs the advantages of wealth presented today. Elena's breath caught sharply, though she did not yet dare to believe. This court therefore rules, the judge said, that primary custody shall remain with the mother. The words seemed to hang in the air, unreal. For the child's continuity, emotional security, and best interest, the judge added, this arrangement shall not be altered. He nodded once firmly, as if sealing the decision. This ruling is not a rejection of the father, he concluded, nor is it a punishment. It is an acknowledgement of what has already been proven through years of quiet action. The judge lowered his gaze, finalizing the decision. And in that moment, the law did something rare. It stepped aside just long enough for justice to pass through. For a moment after the ruling, the courtroom did not react. It was as if everyone needed time to adjust to the idea that something rare had just occurred. The law had spoken, yes, but it had spoken differently than expected. Elena felt the words reach her slowly, like sound traveling through water. Primary custody shall remain with the mother. Her knees weakened, but she held herself upright, gripping the edge of the table just enough to stay steady. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry yet, not in front of everyone. She had learned to contain joy the same way she contained pain. Lucas understood before she did. He turned toward her, searching her face, and when he saw the shift there, the tension leave her eyes, his body reacted instinctively. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pressing his face against her, holding on as if afraid the moment might slip away. Elena's hand came down over his back, firm and protective, and this time she did not hold herself still. She bent slightly enough to meet him where he was. Across the room, Daniel sat motionless. The ruling did not humiliate him. It did not accuse him, but it dismantled the certainty he had brought with him. He heard the judge's reasoning clearly, not as an attack on his resources, but as a reminder of what those resources could not replace. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the outcome settling in. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly accepting what had been decided. The attorneys began gathering their papers quietly. There were no objections, no motions filed in protest. The decision had been careful, grounded. It would stand. The judge watched the mother and child for a brief moment longer than necessary, then looked away, restoring the boundary between compassion and duty. He had done what he could within the confines of his role. He knew how rare that was. Keanu remained seated in the back row, his posture unchanged. He did not smile. He did not move. He let the moment belong entirely to the family at the center of the room. The letter had done its work. His presence was no longer required. The judge gave final instructions, his voice returning to procedural clarity. Schedules would be formalized, visitation addressed. The mechanics of the ruling would be handled properly. But those details felt secondary now. What mattered had already been decided. The court was adjourned. As people began to rise and the room slowly returned to motion, the impact of the words lingered. Not as spectacle, as affirmation. In a system built on limits, one decision had made room for something more. Justice grounded not in wealth or leverage, but in love that had proven itself every day, quietly, long before anyone thought to measure it. Lucas understood the words before anyone explained them to him. He did not wait for lawyers to gather papers. He did not wait for the judge to finish formal instructions. Something in his body reacted the instant the tension left his mother's shoulders. It was subtle, but to him it felt like a door opening. He turned fully toward her, For a fraction of a second, he searched her face, needing confirmation. And there it was. Not certainty yet, but release. Her eyes were wet. Her mouth trembled. The tightness she had been holding all day finally broke. That was enough. Lucas ran, not fast, not dramatic, just urgently. His shoes scuffed softly against the courtroom floor as he crossed the small distance between them, arms lifting before he even reached her. He pressed into her, burying his face against her stomach, wrapping himself around her as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Elena did not catch him so much as collapse around him. The strength she had been holding together for hours, for years, gave way all at once. Her knees bent slightly, her upper body folding forward as she clutched him tightly. One hand pressed firmly against his back. The other cradled his head. She inhaled sharply, then again struggling to draw in air as sobs broke free from her chest. They were not quiet sobs. They were deep, shaking, uncontrolled. Her breath came in uneven gasps, each one sounding like a body, relearning how to breathe after being underwater too long. She rested her forehead against his hair. Eyes closed, tears soaking into his shirt without apology. Lucas held on just as tightly. He did not cry at first. He simply clung to her, his small body pressed into hers, grounding her even as she trembled. He felt her shaking and tightened his grip, anchoring himself to the one thing that had never failed him. Around them, the courtroom watched. No one moved to interrupt. No one spoke. Even the judge remained seated, hands still allowing the moment to exist without intrusion. The lawyers stood frozen, papers half gathered, eyes fixed on the mother and child locked together in the center of the room. The sound of Elena's breathing filled the space, briefly raw and unfiltered. The smell of old wood and paper seemed to fade as something warmer took its place. Relief. Release. The quiet aftermath of survival. Lucas finally lifted his head and looked up at her. His eyes were wide, searching just as they had been all day. This time, when he looked, he found her smiling through tears. "It's okay," she whispered the words barely audible, more breath than sound. "I've got you." Lucas nodded, his own throat tightening now as the meaning settled fully. His face crumpled, and he pressed himself back into her, a small sob escaping him at last. Elena held him tighter, rocking slightly the way she had when he was younger, when nights felt endless and fear needed movement to fade. This was not a celebration. It was a release, the end of holding everything together alone. And as mother and child clung to each other, the courtroom bore witness to something no ruling could fully capture. A family reunited not by law, but by love that had already survived everything else. The room stayed still as Elena and Lucas held each other. Time seemed to stretch not uncomfortably, but gently, as if everyone understood that this moment could not be rushed. The sounds of the courthouse outside the room no longer mattered. Phones buzzing in pockets, doors closing down the hall. None of it reached them. Elena's sobs slowly softened. They did not stop all at once. They faded in waves, each breath a little steadier than the last. Her grip on Lucas loosened just enough for her to pull back and look at him properly. She cupped his face in her hands, thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized were already there. She studied him as if seeing him again for the first time. The curve of his cheeks, the seriousness in his eyes that had come too early, the familiar scent of his hair. All of it was still there, still hers. Lucas looked back at her, searching for any sign that this could still be taken away. When he found none, his shoulders finally dropped. The tension he had carried without knowing it melted out of him, leaving behind exhaustion and relief, tangled together. "You're staying," he said quietly. It was not a question. Elena nodded, unable to trust her voice yet. She pulled him close again, this time not out of fear, but reassurance. Her breathing evened, her hands stopped shaking. Around them, people began to move again, but carefully, respectfully. Chairs were straightened without noise. Papers were gathered more slowly than necessary. Conversations, when they resumed, stayed low and subdued. No one wanted to break what had just happened. Daniel stood and watched from across the room. He did not approach. He did not interrupt. He saw now clearly what he had underestimated. Not Elena's strength, but the depth of the bond between her and the child he also loved. He felt a mix of regret and acceptance settle in his chest. The decision no longer felt abstract, it felt human. The judge rose at last, signaling the true end of the proceedings. But even then, the focus of the room remained on the mother and child. On the way, Elena finally stood upright again with Lucas at her side. On the way, he stayed close, his hand slipping naturally into hers. Keanu watched quietly from the back row. He did not step forward. He did not look for acknowledgement. He saw what he had hoped to see. Proof that dignity once given could return years later in a form no one expected. As Elena and Lucas prepared to leave the courtroom, she paused for just a moment, pressing her lips to the top of his head. Her eyes were still red, her face still marked by tears, but her posture was different now, lighter. They walked toward the door together, not hurried, not hesitant. Behind them, the courtroom slowly returned to routine. But the people who had witnessed that embrace would carry it with them long after the room emptied, because they had seen something rare. A child run not from fear but toward safety, and a mother finally allowed to breathe again. The judge was the first to fully regain his composure. He straightened the papers on the bench, aligning the case file and the folded letter with deliberate care. The moment of humanity had passed, and now duty required closure. His expression returned to professional neutrality, but something in his eyes had changed, not softened, deepened. He cleared his throat once and gave brief procedural instructions, his voice steady again. Dates would be confirmed, orders would be finalized. The machinery of the court would continue as it always did. Yet, even as he spoke, it was clear that this case would remain with him longer than most. It had asked more of him than interpretation. It had asked reflection. Daniel lowered his head, not sharply, not in frustration, just slightly as if acknowledging something he had not fully understood before walking into the room. He stared at the floor for a moment, hands resting loosely at his sides. There was no anger in his posture, no resentment, only realization, the awareness that something essential had been missing from his calculation all along. He exhaled slowly, then straightened again. When he looked toward Elena and Lucas, his gaze held none of the defensiveness from earlier. It held distance still, but also acceptance. The outcome no longer felt like a defeat imposed on him. It felt like a truth revealed too late to ignore. The attorneys moved quietly. Papers were gathered without haste. Briefcases were closed softly. There were no whispered reassurances, no celebratory gestures. Professionalism guided their actions, but so did restraint. They had done their work. The court had responded. There was nothing more to add. Elena stood with Lucas beside her, her hand still wrapped around his. Her breathing had steadied, but her awareness had sharpened. She took in the room slowly now, as if seeing it for the first time, without fear clouding her vision. The bench, the counsel tables, the faces that had watched her life be measured. And then she looked toward the back row. Her eyes scanned the seats carefully. She searched not for recognition, but understanding, for the presence that had shifted the room without claiming it. She did not yet know his intention. She only knew that something extraordinary had happened and that it had not come from the system alone. She spotted him. Keanu was seated quietly where he had been before, his posture unchanged, his attention lowered as if already stepping back into anonymity. He did not look toward her. He did not seek acknowledgement. In that moment, he was exactly what he had intended to be, invisible again. Elena's breath caught. Recognition arrived fully now, not as shock, as clarity. The hallway, the late night, the thank you she had written with trembling hands years ago, never imagining it would travel this far. She felt a wave of emotion rise again, not overwhelming, but profound. Gratitude layered with disbelief. She did not speak his name. She did not wave. She only held his gaze for a brief moment, enough to communicate what words could not. Thank you. I remember. My child remembers. Keanu lifted his eyes just long enough to meet hers, then nodded once. Small, respectful, final. The exchange passed unnoticed by most, but for Elena, It closed a circle she had never expected to see complete. The courtroom continued to empty, but the weight of consequence lingered. Not the consequence of winning or losing, the consequence of being seen. The room slowly began to return to motion, but it did so cautiously, as if everyone sensed that moving too quickly would feel disrespectful. Chairs slid back with care, shoes scuffed softly against the floor, voices, when they returned, stayed low and restrained. The judge gathered the remaining documents and stood signaling the formal end of the session. He did not linger. He did not offer commentary. His role was complete. Yet, as he stepped away from the bench, his expression suggested that this case would follow him long after the courtroom emptied. Some rulings did that, not because they were controversial, but because they revealed the limits of certainty. Daniel prepared to leave. Before turning away, he looked once more toward Elena and Lucas. He did not approach them. He did not speak. But the look he gave was different from the one he had carried into the room. It was quieter, less defended. He nodded once, almost to himself, as if acknowledging a truth he would need time to absorb. Then he turned and walked out. His footsteps measured his posture, thoughtful. The attorneys followed their movements, efficient but subdued. There were no congratulatory words exchanged, no disappointment voiced, just a shared understanding that something meaningful had happened beyond legal victory or loss. Elena stood still for a moment longer, allowing the noise level to rise just enough to signal that the danger had passed. She squeezed Lucas's hand, gently grounding herself in the simple fact that he was still there, still beside her. She felt an unfamiliar sensation settle into her chest. Relief without fear attached, safety without conditions. She looked around the room one last time. Her gaze returned briefly to the back row, but Keanu was already standing, preparing to leave. He moved without drawing attention, folding his coat over his arm, stepping into the aisle with the same quiet presence he had arrived with. He did not look back. He did not wait. Elena understood. Some acts were not meant to be followed by conversation. Some kindness existed best when allowed to disappear. She turned toward the exit with Lucas, her steps lighter than when she had entered. As they reached the door, she paused for just a second, letting her eyes travel once more across the space where her life had been weighed. It no longer felt threatening. It felt resolved. Lucas tugged her hand gently, eager to leave. She smiled down at him, a real smile this time, and nodded. Together, they walked out of the courtroom. Behind them, the room emptied completely. The benches returned to stillness. The papers were filed away. The system reset itself for the next case. But something remained, a quiet residue of consequence. Not the consequence of law enforced, but of humanity acknowledged. And for everyone who had been there, the memory of that day would linger as proof that sometimes, even in places defined by limits, justice could still find room to breathe. Keanu waited until the movement in the room had settled enough to no longer draw attention. He did not rush. He did not linger. He stood when the timing felt right, when standing would not interrupt anything that still needed to breathe. As he stepped into the aisle, the judge happened to look up. Their eyes met briefly. Keanu inclined his head in a small, respectful bow. It was not formal, not performative. It carried no expectation of acknowledgement. It was simply a gesture of gratitude offered quietly from one person to another. The judge returned the nod just as subtly, his expression composed, thoughtful, already turning back toward the responsibilities waiting beyond the bench. No words were exchanged. Keanu did not turn toward Elena, not because he did not feel the pull to do so, but because he understood the importance of restraint. This was not a moment for recognition. Gratitude did not need an audience. Closure did not need conversation. He had learned that some kindnesses were strongest when they ended cleanly without ceremony. He adjusted his coat over his arm and walked toward the courtroom doors. No one stopped him. A few people noticed him leaving, but no one spoke his name. No whispers followed. No phones were raised. The room was still carrying the weight of what had just happened, and there was no space yet for spectacle. The door closed softly behind him. The hallway outside felt different now, longer, quieter. The sounds of the courthouse echoed in measured rhythms, footsteps, distant voices, the squeak of a cart being pushed somewhere far away. Keanu walked at an unhurried pace, his shoes tapping lightly against the polished floor. With each step, the tension that had followed him all day loosened. He passed by closed doors marked with case numbers. Each one held a story. Most would never intersect. Most would never be seen beyond their files. He thought of the letter in his pocket, now returned to its place, no longer a question waiting to be answered. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel relieved. What he felt was quieter than that. A sense of completion, the feeling that comes when a circle closes naturally without being forced. As he moved farther down the hall, the courtroom faded behind him, replaced by light from tall windows at the end of the corridor. Outside, the rain that had fallen earlier had stopped. The air looked clean. Still. Keanu paused briefly near one of the windows, not to look back but to breathe. He rested his free hand lightly against the glass, grounding himself in the present. The world beyond the courthouse moved on, unaware of the small shift that had taken place inside its walls. He turned away and continued walking. No cameras waited at the exit, no reporters lingered, no applause followed him into the open space of the lobby. He blended into the flow of people passing through, just another figure moving through a public building. That was how he wanted it. By the time he reached the main doors, the sounds of the courtroom were gone, entirely replaced by the muted hum of the city outside. He pushed the door open and stepped into the daylight. Behind him, somewhere down the hall, a family was leaving together. Ahead of him, the world waited, unchanged in appearance, but carrying one more quiet story of justice, done without needing to be seen. Keanu stepped fully outside the courthouse, letting the door close behind him without a sound. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain that had already passed. The city moved as it always did. Cars rolled by. People crossed the steps without knowing what had just unfolded a few floors above them. Life did not pause for justice. It rarely did. He stood still for a moment at the top of the steps, not searching for anything, not waiting for anyone, just standing, allowing the weight of the day to settle and then release. The letter remained in his coat pocket, lighter now than it had felt all morning. Its purpose had been fulfilled. It no longer asked anything of him. Keanu descended the steps slowly. Each footfall echoed briefly and then disappeared. No one called out to him. No one followed. He was not a figure of interest here. He was simply another man leaving a public building at the end of a long morning. As he walked, he thought briefly of the many times he had chosen silence over action, restraint over intervention. Those choices had mattered too. Today had not erased them. It had simply asked something different, and now that answer had been given, there was nothing more to hold on to. He reached the sidewalk and merged naturally into the flow of pedestrians. Jackets brushed past him. Conversations overlapped. Someone laughed nearby. The ordinary texture of the world returned, fully grounding him in its familiarity. Keanu did not look back. He did not need to. The courtroom no longer belonged to him. Neither did the outcome. Those things rested where they should, with the people who would carry them forward. He walked a few blocks, letting the city absorb him. With each step, the images of the room softened. The judge's measured voice, the stillness after the letter was read, the moment the child ran. They did not disappear. They simply took their place among other quiet memories that shaped him without defining him. At a crosswalk, he stopped and waited for the light to change. He stood with his hands in his pockets, posture relaxed, eyes forward. Anyone passing would see nothing remarkable. Just a man waiting to cross the street. When the signal changed, he stepped forward again, blending seamlessly into the movement of the crowd. Behind him, no cameras flashed. No voices called his name. No one clapped or pointed. Just footsteps fading into the rhythm of the city. And somewhere else, not far away, a mother and child were walking side by side, carrying something new. Not wealth, not victory, but the quiet certainty that they had been seen. That was enough. Keanu continued on anonymous, once more leaving behind no trace, but a moment that would live on without him. The courtroom emptied. The benches returned to silence. Files were closed and stacked ready to be replaced by the next set of names, the next set of arguments, the next life waiting to be reduced to pages and precedent. To anyone passing by later, it would look like any other room where decisions were made and forgotten. But some moments do not disappear when the doors close. They linger quietly, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they revealed something true. That day was never about a famous name standing up in court. It was about a letter that waited years to be remembered. A few lines written by a tired mother at a small table late at night, never imagining they would one day sit beside a judge's bench. It was about dignity offered once without condition and returned when it mattered most. Justice did not arrive with raised voices or accusations. It arrived in silence, in restraint, in the simple act of someone refusing to ignore what they knew was right, even when it carried no obligation and no reward. The law is powerful. It protects, it orders, it creates structure where chaos would otherwise grow. But the law is also limited. It can only work with what it is given: forms, numbers, records. It cannot measure the quiet heroism of showing up every day. It cannot calculate love expressed through warm meals, clean clothes, and whispered reassurances in the dark. That is where people come in. Not heroes, not saviors, just witnesses. People who remember names when the system remembers numbers. People who notice the ones who move quietly through hallways after everyone else has gone home. People who understand that character is not always visible until someone chooses to point at it and say, "This matters." Elena did not win because someone felt sorry for her. She did not win because rules were broken or favors were given. She won because her life, finally seen in full, spoke for itself. The letter did not argue. It did not plead. It simply told the truth. And the truth was enough. Somewhere long before that courtroom day, a child was watching how adults treated his mother. He was learning what dignity looked like. He was learning whether silence meant invisibility or strength. Years later, he stood in another room, watching again, learning a different lesson. That truth can surface. That kindness can return. That justice does not always arrive on time, but it does not forget. Most acts of courage are never recorded. Most kindness is never rewarded publicly. Most of the good that holds the world together happens when no one is watching, when no one is counting. But sometimes, once in a while, those quiet acts echo. They cross years, they cross rooms, they cross from a folded piece of paper into a moment that changes everything. And they remind us of something easy to forget, that even in places defined by rules and limits, humanity still has a voice. Stories like this rarely announce themselves. They do not arrive with headlines or applause. They unfold quietly, almost invisibly, carried by ordinary people doing what feels right when it would be easier to do nothing. That is why they matter. Because most of us will never stand in a courtroom with a letter that changes a ruling. Most of us will never be asked to speak in a moment where silence has become injustice. But all of us at some point will stand in a smaller version of that room. A workplace, a hallway, a family gathering, a moment where someone is being measured unfairly, misunderstood, or quietly erased. And in those moments, the question is never about power. It is about attention. Did you notice the person who stayed late after everyone left? Did you notice the parent holding everything together without help? Did you notice the child watching how the world treats the people they love? Those moments shape more than outcomes. They shape character. Keanu did not change the course of that day by being famous. He changed it by remembering. By refusing to let a human story remain invisible simply because it was inconvenient to the system. He did not speak over anyone. He did not demand anything. He offered truth and then stepped back. That is what quiet courage looks like. And Elena did not earn justice by pleading. She earned it by living with integrity long before anyone was counting. By showing up every day even when the world did not reward her for it. By teaching her child through action alone what dignity meant. Justice did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived as recognition, Recognition that love can be a form of stability, that presence can be a form of wealth, that some truths cannot be summarized, only witnessed. So now the story turns to you. Have you ever seen someone fight for what was right when no one else was watching? Have you ever been the only person who noticed a quiet act of sacrifice or kindness? Did you speak, or did you stay silent? And if you were sitting in that courtroom watching the law close in while something human struggled to be seen, what would you have done? Would you have trusted the rules to handle it? Or would you have found the courage to remember a name, a moment, a story that deserved to matter? These are not easy questions. They are not meant to be answered quickly. They are meant to stay with you the way that letter stayed folded in a pocket for years, waiting for the right moment to be unfolded. If this story moved, you share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed quiet courage change something important? Or have you ever wished you had spoken up when you didn't? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, not because they are loud, but because they are true, stay with us. There are more moments like this waiting to be remembered, because justice does not always arrive on schedule. Sometimes it waits for someone to care enough to speak, and sometimes that someone is you.